The FBI profiler who caught the Unabomber through language. Just read the Nancy Guthrie Ransom notes. He does not believe the person who took her wrote any of them. 1 preposition. 3 letters. That is the detail that a forensic linguist noticed in the second Ransom note in the Nancy Guthrie case. Not buried in nature. Buried with nature. In English, those two phrases do not mean the same thing. In is the preposition for spatial containment, placing something inside an environment. With expresses accompaniment, association, relationship. A native English speaker writing about burial in an outdoor landscape reaches for in automatically, without deliberation, because that is what English provides for that meaning. The word with, in that same context, is the word a Spanish first language writer would produce, because the Spanish preposition con maps precisely onto the function that with fills in that construction, and the first language structure bleeds through when the writing is done quickly, under pressure, or without formal training in suppressing the transfer. Name sources. Confirmed contacts. On the record. This is Missing People Files. Subscribe right now if you are not already here. Turn on notifications. Hit that bell. The source in this episode is James Fitzgerald, retired FBI supervisory special agent, criminal profiler, forensic linguist, and the analyst whose reading of Ted Kaczynski's writing helped identify the Unabomber and end a 17-year campaign. He read every communication that has emerged in the Nancy Guthrie case this week. His conclusion about all of them, the first note, the second note, and the new TMZ communication, is not what anyone in this coverage has been saying. And the preposition nobody noticed is where the analysis starts. Let's get into it. Before the linguistic analysis. Before the operational history of for-profit kidnapping in America. Before the preposition, this is who this investigation is about. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She was taken from her home in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona, on the night of January 31, 2025. The evidentiary record is not in dispute. Blood on the doorstep, foreign DNA inside the house, surveillance footage of the person responsible on her property that night. She did not leave willingly. The biological evidence confirms she fought back. At 84 years old, she fought. These are confirmed facts, not speculation assembled from competing reports. She was sharp in the way that takes a lifetime to build. Politically engaged, not passively, not in the sense of someone who glances at headlines, but in the active sense of someone who held positions, argued for them, and expected rigor from every conversation she was part of. She read deeply. She tracked stories. She showed up in every room with the precision of someone who had spent a long life refusing to be vague about anything. She was fully in the world, paying close attention. On the last ordinary morning she woke up in her own home. She was also the mother of Savannah Guthrie, co-anchor of NBC's Today Show. That relationship placed this case in a national spotlight that most missing persons investigations never reach. But behind that visibility is a daughter who has been going to work every morning since January 31st carrying what those notes said. Anchoring a national broadcast. Finding the composure while holding the knowledge that the case has not produced what the family is waiting for. That is not performance. That is what survival looks like when it has to be conducted in public, in front of millions of people who see only the surface of it. Nancy's home in the Catalina foothills remains preserved. The throw blanket on the sofa. The grocery list on the counter. The light through the windows exactly as it fell on the last night it was a home. A family holding the decision about what to do with it in suspension, waiting for the resolution that has not come. James Fitzgerald read the notes this week. Here is what he found, and here is why his reading changes the frame on everything the coverage has been treating as settled. Before any conclusion attributed to him in this episode, before any quote, any assessment, any judgment about any of the communications in this case, you need to understand who James Fitzgerald is and why his reading of these notes is the specific analytical authority on this specific question. He spent 21 years as a supervisory special agent and criminal profiler inside the FBI. His assignment was to the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime, the unit that handles the most complex behavioral and language-based cases in federal law enforcement. The cases that do not fit the standard investigative template. The cases where understanding what a person wrote and how they wrote it is the only pathway to identifying who they are. He is a forensic linguist. Not in the academic sense of someone who studied language at a graduate level and then applied theory to criminal cases. In the operational sense of someone who has sat on active federal task forces, read original documents from active investigations, produced analysis under evidentiary standards that federal courts evaluate, and had that methodology tested against real cases with real outcomes. The Unabomber case is the credential that defines his career. Ted Kaczynski killed 3 people and injured 23 over 17 years using mailed explosive devices. For 17 years, the Bureau had physical descriptions, behavioral profiles, geographic analysis, forensic evidence from every device, and none of it produced an arrest. What produced an arrest was language. Fitzgerald read Kaczynski's published manifesto and identified linguistic patterns, specific vocabulary choices, syntactic structures, grammatical habits that recur across a writer's output because language is as individual as a fingerprint. He matched those patterns against a writing sample from a suspect the investigation had not prioritized. The match led to Kaczynski's arrest at his cabin in Lincoln, Montana, in April 1996. The language was the entire case. 17 years of physical evidence could not close it. The writing did. Before moving to his specific conclusions about the Nancy Guthrie communications, one dimension of the Unabomber case deserves emphasis. Kaczynski's manifesto was approximately 35,000 words. It took Fitzgerald and his colleagues years to build a linguistic profile from thousands of comparison texts, communications, and writing samples. The identification did not come from a headline or a paraphrased summary of what Kaczynski had written. It came from someone, specifically his brother David, reading the actual language, every word, every sentence structure, every grammatical habit that repeated because it was that writer's habit. That is the level of access that produces a match. Fragments do not produce that. And the Nancy Guthrie case has been running, analytically, almost entirely on fragments. He also worked the DC sniper case in October 2002, assigned directly to Chief Moose and the Joint Task Force during the shootings that paralyzed the Washington, D.C. area for 3 weeks. He was in the room when the tarot card left at one of the crime scenes was analyzed. The card contained approximately 19 words. One phrase from those words was transmitted incorrectly to the media, and the media discussed the wrong phrase for an entire week, bringing in theologians and religious scholars to comment on what it revealed about the shooter's psychology. Not a single word of that commentary was relevant, because the phrase being analyzed was not the phrase on the card. The investigation ran for a week answering the wrong question because the source material had been misreported before it reached anyone outside the task force. He worked the JonBenet Ramsey investigation early on. He has consulted on kidnapping cases. He has worked threat assessment cases. He is, in Brian Enton's description of this interview, exactly the right person to read the language of every communication that has emerged in the Nancy Guthrie case. What he found should change the way this week's coverage is understood. Start with the most recent communication, because it establishes the baseline for what follows. TMZ is reporting a third note in the Nancy Guthrie case. The sender presents himself as the same person who has written to TMZ before. His claims, as reported, he has the names, addresses, and phone numbers of both individuals responsible for the abduction. He has video of Nancy Guthrie with the primary kidnapper on what he describes as probably the last day of her life. The video is on a phone. The phone is powered off in a secure location. His words, secret but easy to find if you know where to look. His price, 1 Bitcoin, approximately $61,000 at the time of this recording. Harvey Levin of TMZ has asked for a screen grab as proof of concept and has notified the FBI. The communication also includes a reference to the anonymous tip that went to Mexican volunteer searchers, the tip pointing toward a possible burial site near Nogales. He writes, "I am not the idiot who recently called in a tip about her burial site in Mexico." A deliberate move to separate himself from a lead that has already been assessed. Now ask yourself the question Fitzgerald asked immediately. Why TMZ? If this person has the identities, contact information, and video evidence of the people responsible for one of the highest profile abductions in recent American history, what is the logical mechanism for delivering it? The FBI tip line is open around the clock and accepts anonymous submissions. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has an active case file. The legal attaché infrastructure for cross-border coordination with Mexican law enforcement is in place and built specifically for exactly this kind of cross-border investigative need. Every mechanism for safely delivering actionable information to the people who can act on it has been available since January 31st. Why does none of that exist in the calculus of a person who claims to have the names and video of the kidnappers? Fitzgerald's answer, because the claims are not real. Not partially real, not exaggerated from a kernel of truth. Constructed. The hidden phone in a secret location. The video of the last day of her life. The complete package, names, addresses, phone numbers, available for less than the cost of a mid-range vehicle. The content is comprehensive sounding without being specific about anything that can be verified before the Bitcoin changes hands. That is the structure of a fabrication, not of a person in possession of information they are trying to convert into cash. He adds one more point that the coverage has not raised. If this person genuinely has the identities and contact information of both individuals responsible for this abduction, and if those individuals have the operational profile that the evidentiary record of the Catalina Foothills house describes, those individuals would know who he is. People who spent 3 weeks on pre-operational surveillance, used a signal jammer inside a private residence, and executed a 41-minute operation are not people who would leave a witness to their crime free to negotiate Bitcoin amounts in a TMZ email thread. The Bureau should follow it up. Fitzgerald is explicit about this. No thread goes unexamined in an active case. But the follow-up is almost certainly a short exercise that closes one line of inquiry rather than opening anything. If there is a phone somewhere, it holds nothing. The harder conclusion is the one that follows. Here is where this week's coverage and Fitzgerald's analysis diverge, and it is the divergence that matters most. The TMZ communication is the one every viewer already assumed was questionable. The first note, sent to local television stations confirmed by federal agents as something they are taking seriously, addressed to Savannah Guthrie by name, demanding $4 million, is what the coverage has been treating as a legitimate criminal communication. The second note, stating that Nancy died, that she is buried with nature, that the death was not intentional, is the one that Savannah and her family have been carrying the weight of. James Fitzgerald does not distinguish between them. He is skeptical of all of it. Not reluctantly, not with caveats that leave room for persuasion by additional evidence. Flatly, directly, on the record skeptical of every communication that has emerged, because in his operational reading, every communication shows the same behavioral signature. No proof of life. No specific instructions. No operational detail that only the person who was inside the Catalina Foothills house on January 31st could know. Circular information. Game playing. The pattern of someone inserting themselves into an investigation for reasons that have nothing to do with direct knowledge of the crime. Think about what that assessment means for everything the case has been built around this week. The first note said, "Hello Savannah. We have your mother Nancy." It demanded $4 million. It identified Nancy by her relationship to her daughter, which, as Fitzgerald noted immediately, was unnecessary information. Savannah knows who her mother is. There was no functional reason to include that identification in a ransom demand. The identification is there because the note was written to make Savannah specifically feel something, not to conduct a kidnapping negotiation, but to land on a specific person with maximum personal weight. The second note abandoned the ransom demand entirely. It said Nancy died, that she is buried with nature, that the death was not intentional. No follow-up financial terms. No new instructions. No logistical pathway. A statement about death and terrain and nothing more. What does a genuine second communication from a for-profit kidnapping operation look like? Not that. Here is how Fitzgerald knows. This is the context that has been almost entirely absent from the national coverage of this case, and it is the framework inside which Fitzgerald's skepticism is not contrarian but historically grounded. For-profit kidnapping, the abduction of a person for the specific purpose of extracting and receiving a ransom payment, is extraordinarily rare in the United States. Not uncommon. Extraordinarily rare in the specific sense that a criminal profiler with 30 years of case experience can name the significant examples from the past century individually and still have room left over in a single paragraph. The Lindbergh baby, 1932. 20-month-old Charles Lindbergh Jr. was taken from his bedroom in Hopewell, New Jersey. The evidence suggests he died the night of the abduction, almost certainly from a fall coming down the wooden ladder the kidnapper used to reach the second-floor nursery window. The body was discovered 4 miles from the property 11 weeks later. Bruno Hauptmann was identified, convicted, and executed. The original ransom note was left on the nursery windowsill, inside the house at the location where the family would find it immediately, because that is where a note needs to be if its purpose is to initiate a payment process. It was not sent to a newspaper. It was not delivered to a television station. It was placed where it needed to be to start the negotiation the kidnapper intended to conduct. Frank Sinatra Jr., 1963. 19 years old, abducted at gunpoint from a hotel room at Lake Tahoe. Held for 4 days while his father assembled $240,000 in cash. Released after payment. 3 people were arrested within days of the release. The operation maintained specific, ongoing communication with the Sinatra family, clear instructions, a maintained channel, a living person available for return after payment was confirmed. It failed completely for the kidnappers. All three were caught. But it had the operational structure of a genuine ransom enterprise, which is what made it recognizable as one. Sidney Riso, 1992. President of Exxon USA, taken in Florham Park, New Jersey. Shot in the arm during the abduction. Died 3 days later from the wound. His kidnappers, 4 people, 2 of them former Exxon employees who knew his schedule and security profile, did not know he was dead. They continued sending his credit cards and company identification in the mail as proof of life, not knowing the man those documents belonged to no longer existed. The FBI identified all 4 in short order. The case closed fast. But in the period before his death, the operation had proof of life, had communication, had the logistical structure of what it was. Consider the JonBenet Ramsey case as the counter-reference. Fitzgerald worked that investigation early on and raised it in this interview specifically because the note left in the Ramsey house is, in his assessment, the closest domestic parallel to what a genuine kidnapping note structure looks like, even though the JonBenet case was not a real kidnapping. The note was 3 pages long. It contained specific payment instructions, a specific amount, a specific warning about what would happen if police were contacted, a timeline for follow-up contact, and language that was extensive enough to provide a genuine analytical footprint. It was placed on the staircase inside the house, where Patsy Ramsey found it the morning of December 26. Not sent to a TV station. Not routed through a media outlet. Left in the location where the family would encounter it immediately, because the note was written, however incoherently and contradictory its contents ultimately proved, to initiate a specific transactional process. That is what a kidnapping note does. It initiates a process. The Nancy Guthrie notes initiate nothing. They describe. They assert. They do not instruct. Fitzgerald also has awareness of a 2018 case in Norway, a businesswoman abducted, notes left in her residence, Bitcoin demands issued, the case unresolved as of the time of this episode. He is aware of a New York tuxedo merchant in 1993 whose former employees held him in a hidden location. He helped the NYPD work that investigation. The full list of significant for-profit kidnapping cases in American criminal history fits inside a paragraph. Now apply that historical baseline to the Nancy Guthrie communications. Genuine ransom kidnappers across a century of documented cases leave the initial communication at the crime scene, inside the house in the room the family enters first, with specific instructions for what comes next. They offer proof of life because without proof of life there is no payment rationale. They maintain a communication channel because without ongoing contact the operation cannot progress toward the financial objective. They provide logistical specificity, a number, a location, a timeline, a mechanism. They do not send notes to television stations. They do not issue communications with no instructions. They do not follow a financial demand with a second note that abandons the demand entirely and pivots to a statement about the circumstances of a death, with no pathway to any verification. Real kidnappers in the historical record either collect the money or they are caught trying to. They do not write messages designed to make a specific person feel something. Ask yourself what the Nancy Guthrie communications look like when you hold them against that record. Fitzgerald has held this theory from his first engagement with the case. He has refined it as new reporting has emerged. And he stated it plainly in this interview. The abduction of Nancy Guthrie was not about money. It was about Savannah. The person who spent 3 weeks on pre-operational surveillance before January 31st, who visited the Catalina Foothills property on January 11th, who mapped the sight lines, the security profile, the patterns of an 84-year-old woman's ordinary evenings at home, was not building a dossier for a ransom enterprise. They were building a dossier because they had a specific personal fixation on a specific target they could not reach directly. Savannah Guthrie is a public figure. She is accessible in the limited, mediated way that public figures are accessible, through social media, through the Today Show, through the standard channels that a fixated individual exhausts before they escalate. Fitzgerald's reading. Those channels were exhausted. The imagined relationship was not reciprocated. The escalation moved to the one person in Savannah's immediate life who was more physically reachable than Savannah herself. Not her children, too complicated, too well protected, and too young to produce the specific psychological effect on Savannah that the person was seeking. Her mother. An 84-year-old woman living in a home that 3 weeks of surveillance had made completely predictable. The sight lines, the entry points, the routines, the absence of the security infrastructure that surrounds a national television personality. The first note was addressed to Dear Savannah. Not to the Guthrie family. Not to Savannah's legal representatives. To Savannah by name in the second person. We have your mother, Nancy. Fitzgerald noticed it immediately. There was no functional need to identify Nancy as Savannah's mother. Savannah knows who Nancy is. That identification exists in the note because the note was written not as a logistical document in a kidnapping operation, but as a communication designed to land on a specific person with maximum personal weight. To make Savannah feel, specifically, the thing the author wanted her to feel. The money was not the point. Making Savannah experience this was the point. If that theory is correct, if the abduction was the act of a fixated individual who had run out of other pathways to the object of that fixation and escalated, then every note that followed from January 31st onward makes a different kind of sense. This person is not conducting an ongoing ransom enterprise. They went home. They are carrying what they did. And every communication that has emerged since January 31st is, in Fitzgerald's assessment, someone else. The actual abductor is not writing to TMZ. They are not sending notes to television stations. And Fitzgerald said something directly that the coverage has not drawn the full implication of. The actual abductor is the happiest person watching every time a new note arrives. Every opportunist who inserts themselves into this case with a fabricated communication is, however unintentionally, providing cover, diverting the investigative bandwidth and the public conversation away from the person carrying the actual answer. What is that diversion by the person who was inside that house? Time. Distance. The absence of direct pressure. And eventually, perhaps, the belief that the calculation they made when they chose those words is still holding. It is not. Now the detail that a forensic linguist pulled from the second note's language that no one else in the national coverage has identified. Not buried in nature. Buried with nature. Read both versions slowly. In English, when you describe placing a person or an object inside an outdoor environment, the preposition is in. You are buried in the earth. Buried in the ground. Buried in the desert. Buried in the natural landscape. That is the automatic, unconsidered, default grammatical choice of a native English speaker. The word the language provides for spatial containment, produced without deliberation because it is simply what English uses in that context. A native English speaker does not pause to consider whether in or with is correct for this usage. They write in because that is what flows from the meaning they intend. The word with does not flow from that meaning in English. With expresses accompaniment and association. You are buried with your possessions, meaning they were placed alongside you. You are buried with your ancestors, meaning you share a resting place with them, not that you are contained inside them. Buried with nature, read through native English grammar, does not describe placement inside a landscape. It describes a relationship between a person and nature that is lateral rather than containing. But in Spanish, the preposition con, the word for with, functions in spatial contexts where English would use in. Con naturaleza. The Spanish speaker composing this phrase in their first language would produce con, which their mind translates directly into English as with. The native English correction, in, does not fire because the thought did not originate in English. The first language structure surfaces in the second language output. This is a known linguistic phenomenon. L1 transfer, the bleeding of first language grammar into second language writing, most visible in preposition usage, where languages diverge most sharply from one another in ways that are nearly invisible to the first language writer. Fitzgerald himself made the correction automatically when he was making notes before the interview. He wrote buried in nature, then went back and crossed it out when he reread the actual reported quote and saw with. The instinct of a native English writer is to fix the preposition without registering that a choice is being made, the same way a reader automatically resolves a typo into the intended word without noticing the error. What Fitzgerald noticed is that the second note's language required a deliberate act to unfix, to read the preposition that is there rather than the one that should be there. He referenced the DC sniper case because it is the cautionary example for exactly this kind of analytical work. The tarot card at the crime scene contained the phrase "Call me God." It was transmitted to the media as "I am God." Theologians and religious scholars spent an entire week in public commentary analyzing what it reveals about a criminal's self-conception when they say "I am God." Not one word of that analysis was relevant because those three words were not in the document. The actual phrase, "Call me God," which, it turned out, came from the film Navy SEALs, where the sniper character was nicknamed God for having the power of life and death, was never examined at all. The investigation ran for a week on the wrong material. The Nancy Guthrie case cannot afford to run on the wrong preposition. And the preposition that is actually in the second note, with, is, in Fitzgerald's reading, not random and not meaningless. In a case set in the Arizona terrain less than 100 miles from the Mexican border, in a region where Spanish is the first language of millions of people and the second language of millions more, A note containing an English preposition that maps directly onto the Spanish grammatical structure for the same phrase is a signal worth taking seriously. The operational significance of this analysis is not abstract. If the author of the second note is a Spanish first-language writer composing in English, that narrows the author profile in a specific direction that is geographically relevant to this case. The Arizona-Mexico border region has a population of millions. But the intersection of someone with a specific Spanish to English preposition transfer pattern, proximity to or knowledge of the Tucson area, and a motivation for inserting themselves into the Nancy Guthrie case is considerably smaller. A forensic linguist with the original documents could potentially compare the syntactic profile of the second note against writing samples from individuals already in the investigation's scope. That kind of targeted comparison, the same methodology used to confirm the Kaczynski match, requires the original text, not a fragment reported through the media. But the analytical pathway exists. What does a bilingual listener carry when they hear the phrase buried with nature? One podcast listener in Brian Enton's audience, described as a bilingual English and Spanish speaker, noticed it first and wrote in with the observation. Buried with nature sounds unnatural in English, they said. The preposition with carries the weight of the Spanish word con in this usage. Fitzgerald, as a forensic linguist, cannot reach a firm analytical conclusion from a quoted snippet. He would need the original documents, the exact spelling, punctuation, spacing, and syntactic layout of the full text, to produce the kind of analysis he applied to the Unabomber manifesto. That is the standard. Snippets produce hypotheses. Full texts produce findings. But the preposition is a hypothesis worth building, in a case where language may be the evidence that the ground and the notes together can point the investigation toward a specific person. Fitzgerald's requests are specific and they are operationally grounded. First, bring a forensic linguist onto the task force who has actual case experience. Not a linguist with academic credentials and a general background in language analysis. Someone who has worked active federal investigations, produced analysis under evidentiary standards, and had that methodology evaluated in court. The distinctions he is drawing, the preposition, the syntactic structures, the vocabulary choices that indicate a writer's first language or educational background or geographic origin, are not reliably extracted by someone who has not done this work inside a case. They require expertise that is different from general linguistic knowledge. The field is small. The people with this specific combination of credentials are not common. He hopes the task force has already engaged one. He cannot confirm it. Second, get the original documents. Not the quoted fragments that have passed through multiple layers of journalism and resummarization before reaching the public or the analytical community. Not the paraphrased descriptions that the coverage has been working from since January. The original text of the first two notes, in their exact form with exact spelling and punctuation preserved, with the spatial layout of the page intact. The DC sniper case is the reason this matters. 3 words that were transmitted incorrectly produced a week of analytical work aimed at a question that did not exist in the source material. The analytical community working on these notes has been working from fragments. A forensic linguist with the originals would start from a different place. Third, and this is the recommendation that has been entirely absent from this week's coverage, consider releasing the full text of those first 2 notes to the public at the 6-month mark. Not all of it. 1 sentence withheld from each note. 1 specific piece of information that only the actual author of each communication would know, held back for the purpose of screening any false claims or copycat submissions that public release might generate. But the remainder of the text published, because someone in the national audience may recognize the language. Not as a random viewer who is interested in the case. As someone who has encountered that specific combination of vocabulary and syntax and grammatical structure before, in a message, in a letter, in a conversation, from a person they know. Someone who, if they saw that writing in a published document, would recognize it the way David Kaczynski recognized his brother's writing in the Unabomber manifesto. That is exactly how Kaczynski was caught. Not by 17 years of FBI investigative machinery. By a family member who read published language and matched it to private language he had seen before. David Kaczynski contacted the authorities. The match was confirmed. The arrest followed. The pathway that led to the Unabomber's identification is currently closed in the Nancy Guthrie case, because the public does not have the language to recognize. Someone who has read or heard the author of the first 2 notes use language before, in a context with no apparent connection to this case, has no way of knowing that a match might exist, because the text has not been made public. At the 6-month mark, which Fitzgerald named explicitly as the threshold where a task force with no firm arrest should consider a transparency reassessment. That pathway could be opened. What are the task force waiting for? One more thing Fitzgerald said, and it belongs at the center of the frame rather than the edge of it. The actual abductor, the person who was inside the Catalina Foothills house for 41 minutes on January 31st, is not sending any of these notes. Not to television stations. Not to TMZ. Not anywhere. They went home. They are carrying what they did, in the specific, private, irreversible way a person carries knowledge of something that cannot be undone. And they are watching this coverage. Every week that the national conversation is about a new TMZ communication, or the question of whether the first two notes are from the actual kidnapper, or the contents of a Bitcoin demand, is a week in which the investigative pressure and the public attention are not building directly on the person who actually knows the answer. Each fabricated communication that arrives in a TMZ inbox or a television newsroom is, without the sender knowing it, running interference for the one person who most needs this investigation to stay diffuse and unfocused. The person carrying the specific private knowledge of what happened on January 31st has reason to want more notes. More confusion. More weeks of national coverage aimed at language they did not write, toward a person who is not them. But the calculation they made when they chose those words has a counter that the notes cannot touch. The terrain the second note pointed toward, the Arizona desert south and east of Tucson, is keeping a record. As documented in the previous episode of this series, Dr. Pamela Marshall's research at Arizona State University has demonstrated that bacterial and elemental decomposition signatures persist in open sun Sonoran terrain for more than 2.5 years. Statistically significant. Analytically recoverable. Measurable with instruments federal agents have access to right now. At the 6-month mark that Fitzgerald identified as the natural threshold for a transparency reassessment, the signal at any location in that landscape is still inside the detectable window, not at its edge but at its center. The opportunists sending notes can absorb some bandwidth. They cannot change what the ground has been recording since January 31st. The person who went home after January 31st made a calculation about what the Arizona landscape would and would not hold. A forensic linguist just noticed that the language they or someone used may carry the grammatical fingerprint of a first language other than English. And the soil scientist says the landscape is not holding anyone's secret, it is building the case. Two independent evidentiary pathways, both still running. Both still pointing at the same calculation that was wrong from the beginning. Nancy Guthrie woke up on the morning of January 31, 2025, and lived an ordinary day. She did not know that someone had been studying the property for 3 weeks. She did not know what the night was going to be. And when it came, she fought. The blood on the doorstep is the record of that fight. She was 84 years old. She was sharp and present and fully in the world, and she fought the person who came through her door. She is somewhere. A note told us a phrase, buried with nature, and a forensic linguist who spent his career reading the language of criminals just told us that one word in that phrase may not be native to English, and that the person who wrote it probably did not choose the location that phrase describes. Two separate open questions, both still unanswered. Where is she? And who actually composed those words? A daughter goes to work every morning. Children ask about their grandmother. A house waits with the throw blanket on the sofa and the grocery list on the counter, exactly as it was on the last night it was a home. And the person who was inside that house on January 31st is carrying the answer. Still carrying it. Watching the coverage shift week to week, watching new notes arrive that they did not write, watching an FBI forensic linguist notice a preposition in someone else's language and work toward something. They thought those 3 words meant, gone. The analyst noticed the wrong word in them. The ground is not persuaded by them. The FBI has a forensic linguist who caught the Unabomber. They have a soil scientist who proved the desert holds what was placed in it. What they need is someone with the original documents and a location to point the sampling team toward. We have not stopped. And we do not stop until she is found. If you have any information about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, about the person on the surveillance footage near the Catalina foothills in January 2025, including the confirmed reconnaissance visit on January 11th, about anyone whose behavior changed significantly and without explanation after January 31st, about any location in the Arizona landscape or in terrain south of Tucson where you observed vehicle activity that did not belong, ground disturbance without an explanation or any conversation in which someone spoke about the desert or a specific outdoor location with a specificity that cannot be explained innocently, the FBI wants to hear from you. Call 1-800-CO-BI. 24 hours a day. Anonymous tips accepted. What are you carrying that you have not yet connected to this case? That call is the pathway. If you have taken a commercial DNA ancestry test and want your genetic profile accessible to law enforcement genealogical analysts working active missing persons investigations, visit DNA Justice at dnajustice.org. Free. Not publicly searchable. Accessible exclusively to authorized investigators on formally approved cases. Using the same familial DNA methodology that has resolved cold cases across the country when the perpetrator's own profile was not in the system but a relative's was. Subscribe to this channel right now if you are not already here. Turn on notifications. Hit the bell. The man who caught the Unabomber through language just read the Nancy Guthrie notes. He is asking the Bureau to put those documents in front of someone who can do for this case what forensic linguistics did for that one. When that analysis happens, when a name is attached to the surveillance image, when the language produces a match, when the ground returns what it has been holding since January 31st, you need to already be watching. This is missing people files. One preposition. A forensic linguist noticed it. The investigation is not finished. Neither are we.